All right. Well, welcome again, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you and share space with you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Ryan Ross. I have the honor and privilege of serving as your Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Equity, and Inclusion at the System Office and providing leadership to the statewide E&I Council. And so, again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for participating in this month's Equity University. And I just want to say a special thank you to folks on my team, Dr. Tina Moore and Matthew Archuleta. Without them, this work really doesn't happen. And it's absolutely okay to keep your video muted, to be on or off camera, whatever works for you, whatever allows you to be in the space in a way that allows you to participate and be present. Please do so. This session will also be recorded. We have a number of folks who couldn't be here today, either because they're teaching or they've got things going on. And so if folks ask you, yes, this session is being recorded and it'll probably be available within 2 or 3 days after today. And so if anybody has any questions about that in the meantime, feel free to email myself or Dr. Moore, and we'll be happy to get you any information you need. As we start, just want to please do mute yourself so that way we don't have the echo. And I'm going to start and open up our space reading our land acknowledgement. The Colorado Community College System respectfully acknowledges the land on which our campuses are located and the site on which we are presenting today. The site on which we're presenting today includes the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Pueblo, Shoshone, Kiowa, and Ute Nation tribes and peoples. These lands were also the sites of trade gatherings, generational migration routes, and places of harvesting, hunting, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all of the living things within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, we hope to renew and reaffirm the ties that indigenous nations have on their traditional lands. So again, welcome. And for some of you, this will be new information. For some of you, this will be a great reminder. The goal about Equity University is just to keep us ingrained in the work and to keep us thinking about how we do the work, get better, how we think about it, and provide an opportunity for us to think and push ourselves in a direction that allows us to show up in a way that we support every person on our campus, every stakeholder, student, faculty, staff member thrive. That's our ultimate goal. And today, I have the honor and privilege of introducing just a tremendous individual, and I'm so excited that she has time to spend with us today. We'll only be together for an hour today because she's also a president. Dr. Yoshiko Harden currently serves as the president of Renton Technical College, and she provides leadership and oversight for all aspects of the college. And so, Dr. Harden, we are so excited that you could spend time with us today. I'll share a little bit about you. She has also served as the interim president of Seattle Central College, one of the 3 colleges in the Seattle College District. She served as the vice president of student services at Seattle Central. She's been the vice president for diversity, the chief diversity officer at Bellevue College, where she led college-wide initiatives in equity and recruiting, hiring, professional development for faculty, staff, Title IX, Violence Against Women Act, and a plethora of other things. In 2015, she was a recipient of the Seattle Medium Black Press Trailblazer and Role Model Award. She's a recent graduate of the 2022 Aspen Fellowship program and is just a diehard advocate for students' education and technical and community colleges. And so we're just so excited. We can go on and talk about you, Dr. Harden, but thank you for sharing space with those of us here in Colorado. And I'm going to get out of your way because I know time is limited. Thank you again for being here. And please just accept this as a warm and hearty welcome from the members of the Colorado Community College System. And the last thing I'll just want to say is just want to recognize that our system chancellor is here, Dr. Joseph Garcia. And thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, for being with us. And here is Dr. Harden, everyone.
Thank you, Doc Ross. What a pleasure to be here. Chancellor Garcia, faculty, staff, other leaders across your district. I also was in a district for 6 years, so I know the pros and woes and complications, but the tremendous work you can do as a large entity. So I'm going to test my screen share. I do have a slide deck. And are folks viewing a slide deck? Okay. Is this image okay? I don't like it how it cascades across. So can you see the slide? The slides? All right. All right. I see a couple nods. So I'm going to jump in. So a little context setting. The title of this session, conversation, discussion is the damaging effects of racial microaggressions, which is the topic of my dissertation that I completed in 2019. It was around Black males in community technical college and their perceptions and experiences around racial and gender microaggressions. Gorski has a great article that he titles "Good Intentions Are Not Enough." So, there's a lot in microaggression space, or just in addressing racism or other isms that talks about intent. So we'll talk a little bit today. As Dr. Ross mentioned, we have an hour, so this is kind of a sprinkling, and I hope to leave you with some questions and discussions. I know this is your first Equity U of the year for this series, so just a brief kind of introduction and a little bit about myself. Ryan's pretty much shared it, but I do want to say there will be some examples that could have language or topics that I just want folks to be prepared for and not caught off guard. I'll go over what the literature around individual and institutional microaggressions. There are all different types of microaggressions. A lot of this conversation today will frame around race and gender. And then I want to end with Dr. Paul Gorski's framework on common racial equity detours that we see across education, and then the kind of equity principles and some time for discussion or questions or feedback. So a little bit about my background. So my current role is as college president. I've been in this role now since July 1, but this is my 21st year working in community technical college, all in Washington State. So all of my professional experience has been all in the CTC system in my state. Just things, I'm really passionate about access and equity and, actually doing the things we say we do as institutions. And really it comes from my desire to create that college experience that I always wanted as an undergraduate or a master's student or a doctor's student that I never fully realized. That sense of belonging, that comfort and ease, that reflection of myself in the curriculum in front of the classroom, all of those things we talk about today and have been talking about for many years. So I'm not going to go into a lot around adaptive leadership, but this is a change theory that I like to use. I use it with my cabinet to talk about how do we mobilize people to not just survive, but thrive. And I think Dr. Ross talked about thrival, right? Many people we're surviving, but we're not necessarily thriving. And there's some tenets of adaptive leadership that I think are really useful to EDI work. And one of it is, all change brings loss, even change you want. And so I think that's important to consider as we change systems. Some things that we like, right, go away because we are moving forward in our equity initiatives. The other part about adaptive leadership is there are no broken systems. So sometimes we hear, well, the system's broken. Well, their argument is the system is producing, of course, the outcomes it was designed to do. And if you think about higher education and the genesis even of community and technical college in our country and land grant institutions, right? They started as selective institutions for primarily Christian white males and kind of went from there. And then our values are prioritized at the point of execution. And I think this is really important in equity work because often it can become inconvenient. We say we want to eliminate isms, and then it gets kind of too sticky and too hard. And we'll talk a little bit about that when I go over Gorski's equity principles. And then, if change is the goal, it has to be counter status quo, right? And so you're working against the grain, which is difficult. Let me move into individual microaggressions. So this largely comes out of Chester Pierce's work. He was a psychologist in the 1970s, and he started examining how Black people were shown in television and commercials. And he started to coin this term, racial microaggressions. And it was kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts, like slight, insults, etc. Since then, it's been picked up in the kind of counseling and education space by Sue and others. And then in the last 15 years, a lot written in post-secondary literature, primarily in the 4-year college and universities, but we're seeing more in the 2-year space, which is really why I wanted to do it in my realm, because a lot of studies that are done about community technical colleges are not done by people who work or are practitioners in the 2-year system. So just things to take away in terms of defining individual microaggressions. They can be conscious or subconscious actions. They can be both verbal and nonverbal, and I'll go into some examples. They're often stated as compliments. So things I was told early in my career, not recently, "You're pretty for a Black girl," right? That person was thinking they're giving me a compliment. They're usually messages that already convey social bias, right? And they're very connected to stereotypes. And then they further denigrate and marginalize kind of already marginalized and oppressed groups. 2 takeaways for us today that if you remember only 2 things, that would be this about microaggressions, that accumulation is key, right? Bad things happen here and there. That's not what we're talking about. It's the daily lived ongoing experience. It's always being followed in the store. It's consistently being pulled over by the police. A few years ago, I was presenting at a college and a Black male student approached me at the end and he was like, "Thank you. You know, I feel like you've named my experience." And he had recently earned his driver's license. He was 18. And in 10 weeks, he'd been stopped 8 times, 6 times by the same police officer. So never ticketed, never a warning. So the first time he thought, well, I'm a new driver. I must have made a mistake. By the 3rd time, right, he knew something else was happening, and that this profiling and policing. The last thing is that microaggressions relies on the perception of the victim. That's the language in the literature, not the intent of the perpetrator. So what I think as of a microaggression or experience, Dr. Ross may not. And so that can get tricky with intent versus impact, and we'll talk a little bit more. Sue breaks down microaggressions into 3 categories, and sometimes people think, well, that's not micro, and this is not what we're saying. It's that, that paper cut. You can't see it, but it's extremely painful. So the micro doesn't mean it's less important. That's the language that Chester Pierce uses. So the first is micro assault, and that would be what Sue talks about is kind of your everyday racism, right? Conscious, explicit, overt, that most people would think that's wrong, right? So the image on your screen, you'll see a Starbucks. I'm in Starbucks land. This is actually a Starbucks that was a block away from my last job in Seattle. 3 weeks into that role, I was having coffee with a colleague and I felt something warm on my face. And I thought someone had spilled their drink, and I turned and there was a young white male there and he had spit all over me and said, "F and NB," just yelled F and NB. And I kind of fight or flight and I paused, and then he spit all over me again, yelled, and walked out. So as a woman, as a Black woman, I was relaxed. I wasn't the only person of color in the space. I wasn't the only Black person. I was a block away from my job. It wasn't late at night. It wasn't 11 o'clock on a Friday, right? So that's that conscious, explicit, overt example. The next categorization is micro insults, and those can often be unconscious. So, maybe the person doesn't know they're doing it. It's rude, their behaviors or actions or comments that are rude, insensitive, demeaning. Some examples are, saying "I don't see color," or assuming someone was hired because of their race or received some type of acknowledgement because of a racial identity they hold. And then I bolded this profiling and policing people of color, right? This is the ongoing thing. The image on the screen is in the last couple of years, the incident in Central Park where the Black man was bird watching and he was approached by a white woman, and she kind of called the police and elevated the claim that he was a threat, and so on and so on. And the consequences, as we've seen in other examples, can really be deadly. And so I think this is that policing aspect. I'm still followed in stores on a regular basis, right? Just that low level and or high level experience. And students experience it on my campus. I don't know about your campuses, but it was students that got me interested into researching this work when I was an advisor many years ago. The last is micro-invalidation. Sue says he thinks this could be the most harmful, right? Because it really negates your reality and your experience. This is a cartoon of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, they say. And then there's, of course, this big ball of inequality, right? This ball and chain. So a lot of this is around this myth of the meritocracy or the American dream when we think about it in a Western context. This idea that if you work hard, you'll be successful, right? And if you're not successful, it's because you don't work hard. So how many of you know someone who doesn't work that hard and they're quite successful? And how many of you know someone that grinds every day and they're not seeing the outcomes, right? So it's like problematizing this meritocracy, which is such a strong narrative in the United States. They can be unconscious or conscious. So some examples, something happens and you respond, and it's like, don't be so sensitive. Don't be so emotional. When you think about it from a gendered lens, getting interrupted in meetings a lot, that's been a big part of my experience. Not being heard. Probably the most common one we hear, and this isn't asked of me so much, but in the literature, it's like folks who are perceived as Latinx or Asian or API, like, where are you from? Right? And then it's followed up with the no, originally. So this reflecting that you're not here from here, you're not American, when you might be generations upon generations. And then why is that the question that you lead with? And this is not, I don't want the takeaway for people to think like, now I can't ask these questions. That's not the goal. The goal is to build your own self-awareness and also to problematize, why are you leading with those questions? One of the things I try and do is create the conditions so people can tell me what they want me to know about versus me asking. And then there's a lot around racial joking in the literature. And so when challenged, kind of, well, my best friend is part of the LGBT community, so I somehow have license to make that comment or use that terminology. Okay. So these are just real examples that either I've experienced, heard about, or came up through my interviews with the Black male students that I interviewed at my campus. And maybe you all are thinking of some that have come up in your experience. So this was at a previous institution. On the first day of chemistry class, the white faculty member approached only the two Black male students in the class and asked, are you lost? Right? In fact, they weren't lost. They were STEM majors and in the class. An Asian female colleague of mine constantly was told this is only staff parking when she was parking her car. So this policing aspect again. One of the students I interviewed described one of their faculty saying, if you all don't do well in the exam, I'm going to have a fit. And when he asked what type of fit, he said, an end fit. So this, this messaging. Early in my career, it's a big deal to present to the Board of Trustees. My colleague and I were presenting. We worked so hard on our presentation, and the only comment from the board at the end was, you're both so articulate, right? It was just defeating and demeaning. This was actually what prompted me getting interested in understanding the experience, because it describes so much my experience. It was Black male and brown male students, when I was an advisor, talking to me about how they're stopped in the parking lot, especially when they go to the bookstore, they're asked to leave their backpack at the time, but then they watch other students come in and they're not asked to leave their backpack. This was a bias case that I had to investigate at a previous college, where some students came to me really upset. Their instructor hugged every student on the last day of class, except for them, the 3 Black students. So there's a lot around like hugging and hugging students, but if you're probably shouldn't be hugging anyone without their consent, but if you are, then don't, I say just don't hug. But why, the question the students brought was, how come, like, how are we different, right? And you can't rule it out. So I'm going to transition a little bit to kind of resistance and reaction. And so when you experience microaggression or racial microaggression, often there's kind of general same experiences. So in my example, I just froze, right? It was kind of flight or fight. It was that moment of disbelief, right? You're just out about on your day and all of a sudden, something's happening to you. Oftentimes you can confront the situation, you decide, like in my example, I didn't confront the situation because I thought it will only make it worse, but I have in other situations. Sue says that's a catch-22 because confronting the situation, if there's a stereotype towards the identities you hold that you're aggressive or prone to violence or angry, right? And then you act in that way, which might be the appropriate response, then you're just reaffirming the stereotype. And a lot of the men I interviewed for my study, they had so much pressure. They were trying to manage perceptions about them and dismantle them, right? I already know that I'm seen as aggressive. I already know that I'm seen as violent. I already know that I'm viewed like this. So I try to do all these things to mitigate for it. And then of course, Smith's work around racial battle fatigue, where he talks about, kind of symptoms of that are hopelessness, anxiety, depression. And if we're not equity-minded practitioners, to use Ben Simone's language, then we might be misdiagnosing the issue. And when students come to us and they're talking about how they feel frustrated or hopeless or anxious, and we talk to them about time management, right? We might not be thinking about the student holistically. So perpetrators of microaggressions often aren't aware, right? And I'm not talking necessarily about the micro assaults, but the micro invalidation and micro insults. They often don't realize they've offended someone, or when confronted, can kind of be dismissive and view it as trivial. It's not a big deal. But that's where the accumulation piece comes up, right? So that's the piece. And then when called on it, can deny it. So I worked at a college and there was another Black female director. We were the only 2, and we were often mistaken for each other. Although she's 7 inches taller than me, we don't look like it. And when I would correct people, it would be like, stop being so sensitive. You both look alike. Well, it is actually important. I'm not, Natasha. And then intent versus impact. So the work is really focused on less on intent and more on impact, right? If I come and hit someone and then say, well, my bad, right? The impact is still the same, regardless that it was my intention or not. Years ago, when I've used this example with students, I said, so if I came up and hit you, and students were like, that's okay, I hit you back. So it's not a good example for that group, but that's often what perpetrators of microaggressions. And then if you introduce other identities that are at play or power dynamics, right? In terms of authority, who holds the power in that space, it can get really complicated. So I want to shift a little bit to institutional microaggressions. So we've covered individual microaggressions, and then institutional microaggressions or systemic microaggressions or environmental microaggressions, right? That is defined as, right, the practices, the inertia, what the university, to use their language, but what we fail to do, right? That then continues to endorse a hostile campus racial climate for people of color. So this is, I think, the part as a leader leaning into this and changing these structures, right? And I have some questions at the end, around like, what is the sacred cow in your environment? I have some sacred cows, and I think a lot of them can be impediments to actually moving forth and meeting and realizing our equity goals. So a little bit about, so how do microaggressions in institutions, how can they play out? Well, in the research, and this is what I found in my study, is that the most harmful tend to be in the classroom and between teacher or faculty and student. And if you think about community and technical colleges, at least in my college, we are a commuter school. We don't have a residential or housing component. And at a technical college, students are in class 8 to 2, Monday through Friday. So students are actually spending the majority of their time in the classroom with the faculty and their cohort. And sometimes it can be between student and student in the classroom. And if the faculty doesn't intervene, right, then that also sends a message. So I remember when I was a new college student in California, and there was a discussion, this changing the laws around affirmative action in terms of admissions and contracts and all of that in California. And it was very heated. And I remember a white male student standing up in class. We were talking about it in class, and he said, my brother had a 4.2 GPA coming out of high school and 1,400 on his SAT, and she's here. And he pointed to me. I didn't know this person. I never talked to them, right? And the professor didn't do anything. Now, for her, it was like just part of the dialogue and the conversation. But for me, as the only Black student, it was very traumatizing. They can occur in and out of the classroom, depending on your campus, or if you have police or security, right? That can be a space where out of the classroom, that profiling and policing, who are you asking for ID? So even though you have a policy or a handbook where an employee can ask a student for ID, who is getting asked to prove who they are and their right to be there? Campus artwork, statues, leadership across. So my college is 76 years old. I'm the first female and first person of color president in 76 years ever. It's been all white male leadership, right? So it's a series of pictures and then my picture, right? Those all send messages. Names of buildings send a message. Of course, there's a lot around ethnocentric or Eurocentric curriculum or curricula, right? What we teach. I didn't have my first Black teacher ever until I was 21 years old. So prior to that, that was the first time it was anyone who looked like me in front of the classroom. Now, when you think conversely, right, at least in the schools I went to, white students had that from preschool all the way through, right? So those kind of norms, jokes, teachers see them maybe like their own niece or nephew or child, right? That comfort. We talk a lot about diversifying our faculty and staff of color ranks. I think that is one of the sacred cows, at least in my context, is we have collective bargaining agreements, right? So I'm not anti-union, I'm actually pro protection for workers. But when you have years and years of exclusion to some groups to get into teaching or into these unions, and then you have the sole protection of job security based on seniority, it's going to be very difficult to reach your gains in terms of diversifying your faculty. It'd be very difficult for me at my college to do that, given those conditions. And then pet to threat. So something happens, you raise the issue, and then you become the problem, right? I don't know if this has happened to anyone, but it's like, well, we're talking about this, and then I suddenly become the problem. I seem angry. I seem upset when I'm just raising an issue. So that's some of the ways. I like to use this as another example of systemic or institutional microaggressions, or in this case, discrimination. Some of you may be familiar with this study. It's been replicated many of times. I see Dr. Garcia nodding maybe at me. So are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? And it was a labor study to test racial bias and discrimination in the labor market. And what they did is they sent out 5,000 resumes, 2,500 with the Black sounding names, Lakeisha and Jamal. and 2,500 with white sounding names, Emily and Greg. And they set up a call center. And the white sounding names, actually, same exact resume other than the names, and at different levels, entry level, management, senior level. And the white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for follow-up and interviews than the black sounding names, just on name. So my name is Yoshiko Harden. I have a Japanese name. Most people think I'm Japanese, which makes sense. And then on the phone, most people think I'm white. So it can, right, but there is bias just based on names. I've heard in other conversations where screening committees, some people think that if you have a black sounding name or non-white sounding name that you get preference, but I haven't seen that in the literature. So I'm wrapping up before we get into discussion. I want to talk about Paul Gorski's 4 racial equity detours, because I think you can see how they're related to racial microaggressions, and it's a really good framework to kind of do a SWOT analysis of your context. So the first is pacing for privilege. Well, let me back up. So he defines equity detours as equity strategies that create the illusion of progress while they're continuing to cement the inequalities or the inequities. And a lot of his work is in the K through 12 space and somewhat in the post-secondary. So the pacing for privilege. So that means we prioritize the comfort of those most resistant and least invested, right? So we slow down on our DEI work because we want to make sure people feel comfortable. We talk about things like courageous conversations, right? Which are important, but if that's the only thing we're doing, then we're probably not meeting our equity goals, according to Gorski. Or we do a lot of framing around equity work around cultural competency. And what Gorski would say is cultural competency is great, but it's actually not a threat to racism. So his question always is X actually going to help us dismantle systemic racism, right? That should be the question. The second detour is the poverty of culture detour. So this, of course, is what it blames students, right, and their cultures for behaviors, discipline, management, not racial bias. And one of the points he makes is if your equity initiatives feature the word culture more than racism, you may be off track a little bit. So language like, what do we mean when we're saying college ready, right? His whole thing is fix the conditions, not the people, right? Or as Ben Simone talks about, we have to reframe student success as a learning problem of the institution rather than a learning problem of the student. The deficit framing or the deficit ideology, those efforts are on fixing students or on helping them tolerate the conditions. So teaching students to be successful or to navigate the system, or having grit initiatives, right, that obscure the inequities. We could offer coping mechanisms. So we see a lot around trauma-informed practice or mindfulness, and those alone aren't bad, but if that's what only thing we're doing, then what Gorski would say is we're not focused on fixing the conditions as well. The best strategy for minimizing the impacts of racism is to eliminate it, according to Dr. Gorski. The last detour is the celebrating equity detour. And this is talking about what he calls gentle diversity education. So when you think about prioritizing that comfort, right? And comfort is really the epitome of privilege. So you learn about diversity, but not racism, right? You don't want people to feel uncomfortable. That's where we can end up with like the food, fun, and kind of famous people approach to professional development or programs, right? Where you do more, let's learn about each other's cultures. Well, what Gorski would say, that's not a bad thing, but that does not dismantle systemic forms of racism. Transformative racial equity efforts are difficult, but it's not more difficult than navigating racism. That is what Gorski talks about. So he names what he calls 5 equity principles, kind of like, well, how do you approach, what can we do? And the first one is the direct confrontation principle. So name the detours, right? Naming helps us stay focused. Call it out. That language is really important. Ask yourselves, or we ask ourselves, how does racism operate here? How does racism operate at my college? Identify a practice that focuses on fixing, in this case, students of color, rather than fixing the conditions. So kind of doing that survey. The second is the redistribution principle. So of course, equity means that you have to redistribute access and opportunity. Those basic material needs that we all need, of course, food and housing and shelter, but also the non-material things in the curriculum, and back to that equity-minded practitioners. You can start with some of your policies. I was a student conduct officer for a long time. So a lot of those policies in student conduct led to differential outcomes for students in terms of race. Because the big one was disrupting, if students were engaged in disruptive behavior, which is very subjective, right? And so where I would see outcomes different, it was primarily Black and Brown students that were sent to me for being disruptive. What does disruptive mean? The third is the prioritization principle. So the only way to actually successfully redistribute opportunity and access is if students of color, in this case, are the priority. That is where you start. So if we go back to the adaptive leadership slide I showed you, that our priorities are valued at the point of execution, right? You have to be mindful. So one of my things is I value working out. And I value, Dr. Ross knows my husband, he's very into fitness. I value going to the gym. I can actually go weeks without doing it, right? Which tells me that you can hold something as a value and really not engage in it on a regular basis. So that kind of value versus fundamental, centering it. And before you act, right, you have to filter through this lens. Are we acting with the best interest of, in this case, students of color? I think we can look at the last 2 or so years we've been living through the pandemic and see where those disparities showed up, and also see where technology provided more access to some folks or people with disabilities, or where it's been useful in that way, right? So always learning. The fourth is the equity ideology principle. And what he talks about, it's a lens, an equity lens, and it's a commitment, right? No strategy will work if we're not willing to understand how racism operates. That all PD should really also be focused on deep ideological work. Because we have to challenge thinking about racism as a series of incidents, and also understand its incidents and also a system of advantage and disadvantage. And that can be hard because a lot of people think about it and from their own experience. So when we're talking about race, I'll talk about it in my context with my faculty and staff, and some white faculty struggle or staff struggle. And what I always say is, I'm not saying that as a white person, you haven't had a difficult life or had challenges. What we're saying and through the literature is that racism wasn't one of them, right? That in fact, systemic racism aided you. And the last is fix injustice, not kids. Again, focus on the conditions and not fixing the people so that they can survive through the system, but actually thrive through the system. And if efforts around equity are focused on resilience only or grit, then we're probably off track, right? Of course, we want people to be resilient, but if you're a resource, you don't have to rely so heavily on just being resilient. So that's kind of my formal presentation. I covered a lot of territory. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second, and this is my contact information. I hope if anything kind of percolated for you, or if you want to have further conversation, please reach out to me. Think of me as part of, your crew this is how we change systems. These are two questions that I've been really thinking about. What are the sacred cows in your context that impede dismantling institutional racism? I mentioned one of my sacred cows, which is my 4 collective bargaining agreements, right? And my other is, who is the institution? So when I went from like middle management into leadership, today I hear a lot around, well, this happens, and the institution allows it. So when people are talking about the institution, I believe they're talking about me. And I am part of the institution. I'm not the institution as president, I'm part of the institution. So I'm really trying to think about who is the institution. Because when I go to push on equity efforts, what I run into are our policies, right? Our union agreements, are all of these things, right? And so I think it's all of that. So let me stop the share and see if there's any questions or comments from attendees here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harden. And so we definitely want to give you a round and open it up for questions. I just based on some chat, I wanted to start with Diana and then go to Ayelet and then to Tina.
Well, yeah, glad to be joining this, and I'm new to CCCS, so it's really nice to have a group that's moving forward. Yeah, I guess my internalized racism, I guess, is deep, and so I think that was what struck a chord for me. Is like when you were talking about the compliments. I remember the first time somebody told me that, like, "Oh, you're so articulate." But for me, it was actually a compliment because I had never heard that before. Mm-hmm. So it just made me think, like, sometimes it is the first time a person has heard that. So I just wanted to know what you thought about that when, it actually kind of feels good.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think context really matters, right? The relationship matters. So if there's a relationship with that person, it's kind of like I can talk about my mama, but you can't, right? There's certain, right? There's kind of an in-group, out-group. I think, like many times early in my career, I was a waiter when I was in my early 20s, and I was a hostess, and the wait staff would say to me, please don't seat Black people in my section. It's not personal, but they don't tip, and I need to make rent. So for a while, I was like, well, okay, this seemed reasonable, even though me as a Black person, right? and I, in a way, I also knew, like, no, that's, well, I would say, well, I tip. And they'd be like, well, right, this is what happens. This is why it's connected to stereotypes. Well, you become the exception, right? Not the rule, right? Well, you're different. So, and then related to that, many times people would say to me, there's 2 types of Black people. There's, N, and there's Black people. I see Dr. Ross nodding. And you're lucky because you fall into the latter group, right? And so they thought the latter group I learned, I didn't know, first of all, I didn't know there were 2 types. But the latter group I learned, right, was non-threatening, articulate, right? Demonstrated behaviors, right, that made sure that people felt comfortable, right? We see this in the classroom, where when I was a conduct officer and students, I had students, Black students or brown students would come to me and I'd be like, well, so I have this conduct issue. It says you were being disruptive. Well, I wasn't being disruptive. I just stood up and was asking a question and they wanted me to sit down, right? So I think it's not a bad thing that you thought it was a compliment. I mean, I think this is like, what was the intent of the person, right? And
yeah,
and that's where education is so important. Otherwise, it just gets normalized.
Thank you.
Dr. Ross, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. I said we're getting ready to go to Ayelet, but if you have a question, please put your name in the chat. There's quite a few people and I don't want to miss the hand sign because I haven't scrolled through the screens fast enough. Ayelet?
Yeah, and my question relates to something you just touched about in-group and out-of-group. And this is, my question relates to microaggression within the same racial or ethnic group. And if you have any advice of how to deal with it, when you witness that or when you are part of this interaction. And so, for example, I was a faculty for many years and I had students in my class, and they allowed among the group to talk to each other in a language that I don't think is appropriate for anyone, but they felt that it's their right to talk to each other because they share the same racial or ethnic group.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real thing, right? And we see that come up around like use of the N-word or use of what I consider like LGBTQ slurs, but I'm not part of that group, right? So that's not part of, you know, and there's been a lot on reclaiming words for different communities, right? Taking ownership so that it doesn't hold the power. So I think part of like the use of the N-word or other language for other groups can be a piece of that, but there is an in-group, out-group. And sometimes the out-group will be like, well, if you say it, why can't I say it? You know, we see this in hip hop, right? White teens are the largest consumers of hip hop and rap, right? It's white, you know, rappers are rich because of white teens. Right, so I'm not saying it's not complicated, right? But it's having those conversations. So I think you, as when you were a faculty member, recognizing that, and if that role is something you want to help problematize for students, it's a great way to have a conversation, right? But start with building the relationship with the students first. You know, I don't know what you did or didn't do, but my advice would be. This is, you know, there's a term in sociology, like the cultural idiot, right? So talk to me about why do you all talk to each other? Because the way I was raised, right, it was a total no-no, you know, and like creating that relationship and conditions to learn why. Maybe they haven't thought, you know, so I think from an education standpoint, you know, creating that space where students can think about it or your colleagues can think about it versus just what I've seen. Well, no, you know, we get uncomfortable. And so then it's just like, shut it down.
Thank you. This is a great advice, actually. Thank you.
Yep. Tina. Oh, do we lose Tina?
Dr. Moore or another Tina?
Dr. Moore, yes.
Oh, I see on my screen still, but maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. So as we're waiting for Dr. Moore, and if you have a question, please. Okay, thanks, Dr. Moore.
Yeah.
Please put your name in the chat. And one thing that I'd like to just add to that question that Ayelet asked is the importance of narrative, right? And under getting to a space where you can understand contextually where people are in the in group, right? Versus the out group, and understand the why. And sometimes, you know, being able to create that space for that conversation actually will change thoughts of the in group, right? I've had conversations, especially around the N word, with young people who sometimes it just is what it is, what they've been exposed to, what our environments are, and then understanding the harm that maybe it caused a grandmother or a great-grandmother or grandfather, right? Sometimes understanding that narrative and creating space to have those kinds of conversations, right? We call courageous conversations, allows for different kinds of discourse and change. And so definitely take the time. It takes patience and it takes time, but take the time to create that space where narrative can be explored.
Yeah, I mean, I would say relationships precede learning.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You have to build up that capital and that kind of gracious space and that pause. It's like, when we think about the modalities we're in now, right? Sometimes we're on campus and we see each other, sometimes we don't, sometimes, right? So it's like this email, I can't stand email, but right, you can interpret tone through email, you interpret tone in the space you're in. So it's, really important that you introduce that pause and that benefit of the doubt. And depending on your identities you hold, it can be really critical. Like for me, coming in as the first Black person, first woman at a white institution, I'm spending a lot of time on relationships, on a lot of time on folks understanding who I am, on a lot of time on conversations.
All right. Well, we are getting close to the 3 o'clock hour, and I'm happy to give back some time. Want to say thank you. Let's all give Dr. Yoshiko a round, a clap, emoji, something in the chat, if you will. Thank you so much for spending time with us, sharing space. And again, one of the things that I just want to impress upon us all is that these conversations, yes, it's about education. Yes, it's about increasing what we know, but it's also about sitting with what we don't know, right? And about having some uncomfortable moments and walking away with some things to think about. I always like to share that when we leave these spaces, yes, you may learn a few things, but you're not here to become an expert. You're here to really tap into reflection and your thoughts. And so I encourage you to continue to have these conversations and explore. And as always, if I can be of any assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. Please don't hesitate to reach out to those who represent you or your college on the Equity and Inclusion Council. And I'm always happy to be on your campuses to share space, and just want to give a shout out to NJC and Front Range. I've spent a lot of time there in the last few weeks, so it's good to see you guys. Although Front Range, I will say that NJC gave me a really cool sweater. So, not that that's a big thing, but if you have sweaters, I like to wear them. So that goes for anyone. Red Rocks also gave me a really cool hoodie. So, and I'll purchase them if you have them for fundraisers. I like wearing our college stuff. But again, Dr. Yoshiko, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate you sharing space with us. And I think you do have sweatshirts at Front Range. But again, thank you. And then thank you all for taking the time and space to join us, all 165 of you who were here. Thank you again so much. So have a great day, and we will see you at our next Equity University session. And again, this was recorded, and we will be sending it out so you can share. One more round for Dr. Yoshiko.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Thank you for your leadership and the invitation. I hope to meet all of you or some of you in a future date. So we have work to do, and we're doing great work.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time.
All right. All right, everyone. Have a terrific afternoon. Again, thanks for being here.